The studio lights burned bright, cameras rolling, and millions of viewers watching live across the country. On stage sat two familiar figures: Oprah Winfrey, the queen of talk shows, and Senator John Kennedy, known for his sharp wit and unshakable Southern charm. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Oprah asked about politics, his career, and even cracked a few lighthearted jokes. The audience laughed, clapping politely after every exchange. But then, the tone shifted. With a sly smile, Oprah leaned in and asked a question that was less about curiosity and more about ridicule. "Senator," she said, her voice laced with amusement, "you talk a lot about faith. Do you really believe that still matters in today's world? Or is it just something old-fashioned, a nice story for Sunday mornings?" The studio erupted in mixed reactions. Some laughed, others gasped, unsure if it was meant as a joke or a jab. The cameras zoomed in on Kennedy, capturing his every expression. He sat still, his hands folded, his trademark glasses reflecting the stage lights. For a moment, silence filled the room. Even Oprah seemed to expect a defensive reaction, maybe an angry comeback or a politician's carefully rehearsed line. But instead, Kennedy simply smiled. He paused, letting the tension grow, the entire audience leaning in to hear what he would say. His niece Lily, watching from backstage, felt her stomach tighten. She knew this was the kind of moment that could define a career, or end it. The mocking laughter from the crowd stung, and the cameras captured every second of it. And then Kennedy finally leaned toward the microphone, ready to answer in a way no one expected. John Kennedy leaned forward, adjusting the microphone with calm, steady hands. The smirk on Oprah's face suggested she expected him to dodge the question or fumble for words. But instead, his voice came low and steady, carrying the weight of conviction. "Ma'am," he began, his southern drawl unmistakable, "faith is not a fashion trend. It's not something you pick up when it's convenient and toss away when it isn't. For me, faith isn't just about church pews or Sunday sermons. It's the compass that guides me when no one is watching." The audience shifted in their seats. The laughter died out. Every eye was fixed on him. He continued, "When I was a young man, people laughed at me plenty. They said my faith was simple, that it wouldn't survive in politics. But here's the truth. When you believe in something bigger than yourself, it gives you courage. Courage to stand firm when the crowd mocks you. Courage to make decisions that might not be popular, but are right. And courage to remember that this job, this life, isn't just about power, it's about service." Oprah blinked, caught off guard. She opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but Kennedy pressed on, his words now flowing with quiet strength. "Now, I don't expect everyone to agree with me. That's not how freedom works. But I will never be ashamed of saying that my faith matters. Because if a man is too embarrassed to admit what anchors him, then he's already adrift." A hush fell over the studio. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began. First a few hands, then dozens, until the entire audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Cameras flashed, recording a moment no one would forget. Kennedy smiled humbly, glancing toward the crowd. "I may not have all the answers," he added softly, "but I know this. Faith has carried me through storms bigger than this stage, and it will keep carrying me, long after the laughter fades." Oprah sat frozen for a beat, her trademark confidence shaken. She managed a polite smile, but her silence said everything. She had expected a politician's spin. Instead, she got a man's truth. The headlines the next morning would tell the story simply: Senator Kennedy's faith leaves Oprah speechless on live TV. The standing ovation lingered long after Senator Kennedy had finished speaking. The "eyed" sound of applause echoed through the studio, rising and falling like waves crashing against the shore. Camera operators scrambled to capture the audience's faces. Viewers at home needed to see the shock, the pride, and the raw emotion etched on every expression. Kennedy didn't raise his hands for silence. He didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of the crowd's response, and leaned back in his chair with the same calm smile he'd carried throughout the exchange. It was as though the applause wasn't for him, but for the values he had defended. Oprah, usually quick on her feet, struggled to regain her composure. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her cards, her professional poise slipping ever so slightly. "Well, Senator," she managed with a strained laugh, "you certainly know how to command a room." Kennedy chuckled softly. "Ma'am, I don't command a room. Truth does that. And faith, real faith, is truth that doesn't bend." The audience roared again, this time with thunderous approval. Viewers at home watched as Oprah forced a gracious smile, nodding, but it was clear to everyone. The moment no longer belonged to her. Backstage, staff whispered among themselves, stunned at what had just unfolded. Even Kennedy's critics had to admit he had turned a mocking jab into a defining statement. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. News outlets replayed it on repeat. Headlines flashed across television screens and flooded social media feeds. Kennedy turns Oprah's joke into lesson of faith. Live TV showdown, Senator's faith, silences laughter. Unshaken. John. Kennedy's words echo across the nation. People who had never paid attention to politics before now shared the clip with captions like, "This is what real courage looks like." Churches replayed the video during Sunday services. Students wrote about it in their school essays. And across dinner tables, families talked about the senator who had reminded them that faith still mattered. For Kennedy's niece Lily, watching at home, the moment carried a personal weight. She remembered every time she had cringed when classmates teased her for being the senator's niece. But now she felt something different: pride. For once, her uncle wasn't just a public figure on TV. He was living proof that standing firm could turn ridicule into respect. Even Oprah herself, days later, acknowledged the exchange in a follow-up episode. "I may not agree with Senator Kennedy on everything," she admitted, "but his conviction was undeniable. And in a world where people bend too easily, that deserves respect." Kennedy's response became more than a viral moment. It became a story of courage, a reminder that faith is not weakness but strength, that when mocked in public, the quiet power of conviction can silence even the loudest laughter. As Kennedy himself had said, "Faith isn't a costume you wear. It's the anchor that keeps you steady when the storm tries to pull you away." And on that night, under the hot studio lights with the world watching, his anchor held firm. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that unforgettable night refused to fade. What many had expected to be just another talk show interview had instead turned into a cultural moment, a turning point replayed endlessly across television screens, shared on social media, and remembered in sermons, classrooms, and conversations. Kennedy, as always, downplayed the attention. When reporters hounded him outside the Capitol, asking if he had planned such a response, he simply shrugged with a modest grin. "I didn't plan a thing," he said. "I just spoke the truth as I know it. Truth doesn't need rehearsal. It just needs courage." Yet behind his humility, the impact was undeniable. Invitations poured in from universities, churches, and even international forums asking him to speak about faith, courage, and conviction in public life. His office was flooded with letters, some from supporters, some from skeptics who admitted they had been moved despite themselves. One handwritten note stood out. It read, "I was watching with my teenage son. We laughed at first, but then we stopped. We listened. And for the first time in years, my son asked me about God. Thank you for reminding us." At home, his niece, Lily, couldn't escape the wave of attention either. Her classmates who once teased her now walked up to say, "Your uncle's speech, wow." Even Derek, the schoolyard bully, approached her awkwardly one afternoon and muttered, "Guess I was wrong. Your uncle's pretty legit." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as Derek could manage. Lily smiled quietly. For the first time, being the senator's niece felt like a badge of honor, not a burden. Meanwhile, Oprah herself faced questions about the exchange. Journalists asked whether she regretted mocking Kennedy's faith. Her answer was surprisingly candid. "In television, you push, you test, sometimes even provoke. That night I did that. But Senator Kennedy reminded me, and millions of others, that conviction deserves respect even when it isn't fashionable. I learned something too. The moment also sparked a larger national discussion. Talk shows, podcasts, and opinion columns debated the role of faith in modern society. Some dismissed it as old-fashioned, but others argued it was precisely what was missing from public discourse. Oh, foundation that gave meaning beyond politics and trends. For Kennedy, though, the victory wasn't about winning an argument or going viral. It was about showing his niece, his constituents, and anyone willing to listen that courage begins with standing firm when others try to make you bend. Faith isn't about convenience, he told a crowd weeks later at a community event in Louisiana. It's about conviction, and conviction doesn't vanish when someone laughs at you, it grows stronger. The story of that night became something larger than a headline. It became a symbol. Parents told it to their children when explaining why it matters to stay true to their beliefs. Teachers referenced it when talking about courage under pressure, and countless viewers replayed the clip when they needed a reminder of what dignity looks like when tested in public. Months later, when Kennedy stood again on a debate stage, one of his opponents tried to use that moment against him, calling it old-fashioned sentiment. Kennedy smiled just as he had that night with Oprah and replied, "If standing for something eternal makes me old-fashioned, then I'll wear that label proudly." The crowd erupted in applause. In the end, the legacy of that exchange wasn't about John Kennedy alone. It was about a truth bigger than politics, bigger than television. A truth that resonated across generations, that faith, when lived with humility and courage, has the power to silence mockery, inspire respect, and leave even the most powerful voices speechless. And for millions who had watched live, or later, replayed that clip, it was a reminder worth holding on to. Sometimes the strongest answer isn't anger or defense or clever words. Sometimes it's simply standing firm with a quiet conviction that cannot be shaken. That night on Oprah's stage, John Kennedy did exactly that, and the ripple of his response continues to move hearts to this day. Months turned into a year, yet the memory of that live television exchange between Senator John Kennedy and Oprah refused to fade. What many thought would be a fleeting viral clip had instead become something much greater, a touchstone moment, revisited again and again whenever questions of courage, conviction, and faith arose. In classrooms, teachers played the clip to spark discussion about standing firm under pressure. In churches, pastors wove Kennedy's words into sermons about integrity. And in living rooms across America, families replayed it when their children asked why. It mattered to believe in something bigger than themselves. The power of a few sentences, delivered calmly in the heat of ridicule, had created a ripple far beyond the studio walls. For Kennedy himself, life carried on much as before. He still walked the halls of the Senate, still battled over policy, still answered to his constituents. But wherever he went, someone always mentioned that moment. At airports, strangers would stop him and say, "Senator, I don't agree with all your politics, but that night, you spoke for me." At small-town diners in Louisiana, waitresses poured his coffee with a smile and whispered, "Thank you for saying what we couldn't." His niece Lily watched it all unfold with quiet awe. Once embarrassed by her connection to him, she now held her head higher. Her classmates no longer teased her about being the senator's niece. Instead, they asked what it felt like to have an uncle who could silence Oprah with a single heartfelt answer. To Lily, the moment wasn't about celebrity or headlines. It was about realizing that courage could change not just one life, but many. Even Oprah herself, in interviews months later, returned to that night. "I pushed him," she admitted candidly, thinking it would be lighthearted, maybe even funny, but he didn't dodge, he didn't attack. He answered with honesty. And in honesty, there is power. That's a lesson I'll carry with me. Her words, unexpected and humble, only cemented the respect Kennedy had earned that evening. But the true depth of the moment revealed itself quietly, away from cameras and headlines. Letters continued to arrive at Kennedy's office, some from children, some from parents, some from people who admitted they had long since walked away from faith. One letter, written in shaky handwriting from a hospital bed, simply said, "I had given up. Watching you reminded me that maybe I don't have to. Maybe faith is still worth holding." Kennedy kept that letter folded neatly in his wallet, pulling it out from time to time whenever the noise of politics threatened to drown out the reasons he served. In Louisiana, Kennedy began supporting new initiatives for youth, programs encouraging music, debate, and faith-based leadership. "Young people need more than lectures," he told a gathering. "They need examples, and if my moment on that stage gave them even a glimpse of courage, then it was worth every second." The story also began spreading overseas. International news outlets replayed the clip, translating his words into dozens of languages. Messages arrived from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ordinary people who had never heard of John Kennedy before, but were struck by the universality of his answer. "Conviction," one journalist wrote, "is a language the whole world understands." But perhaps the most profound change was personal. Lily, inspired by her uncle's courage, began writing in her journal stories about moments when ordinary people stood their ground. With encouragement, she shared them online, where readers praised her insight and honesty. She realized that courage didn't belong only to politicians or famous figures. It belonged to anyone willing to stand up for what mattered. Looking back, Kennedy himself reflected on the moment with characteristic humility. In a speech delivered quietly at a local church without cameras or reporters, he said, "I didn't silence Oprah that night. I didn't silence laughter. What happened was simpler. Truth spoke louder than mockery. And when truth is spoken with sincerity, it doesn't just defend a man, it uplifts a people." The congregation stood in applause, just as the studio audience had that night. But this time, there were no bright lights, no cameras, no viral clips, only neighbors and friends stirred by the reminder that faith, courage, and truth are not relics of the past. They are living forces available to anyone willing to hold them close. In the end, the story of that live exchange endured not because a senator bested a famous host, but because it reminded a nation of something deeper. That conviction, spoken with humility, carries a strength that cannot be mocked away. And so the legacy of that night lives on, not in sound bites or headlines, but in the countless lives quietly touched, the countless hearts quietly steadied by the reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the courage to believe and the strength to say it out loud. As the months rolled into years, the night Senator John Kennedy silenced a mocking jab with words of conviction was still remembered. What had started as a simple interview segment on Oprah's stage had become a cultural landmark, a moment replayed not for scandal or spectacle but for substance. In an age of noise, his calm answer had become a touchstone of clarity. Colleges added the clip to media ethics courses, dissecting how a single exchange could shift the mood of an entire room. Professors highlighted the contrast. Oprah, master of control, had pressed with humor that cut like a blade, while Kennedy, instead of reacting defensively, had anchored himself in faith. "Notice," one professor said as the clip played for her students, "he never raised his voice, never insulted back. Conviction doesn't need volume, it needs weight." Churches, too, across denominations found themselves returning to Kennedy's words. "If a man is too embarrassed to admit what anchors him, then he's already adrift." Pastors repeated from pulpits, weaving the line into sermons about integrity. For many, it became more than a quote. It became a guiding principle, pinned to refrigerators, scribbled into notebooks, carried in wallets alongside verses of scripture. But the ripple was not only public, it was personal. Lily, now older, looked back at that night as the turning point of her own adolescence. She no longer saw her uncle as just a politician or a source of embarrassment. Instead, he became her living example that courage is not loud but steady. Inspired, she pursued writing more seriously, channeling her observations about courage and truth into essays that began appearing in local papers. Each piece she wrote echoed the lesson she had first seen under the harsh lights of Oprah's studio: stand firm even when laughter fills the room. Kennedy himself, though humbled by the attention, never let the moment become a trophy. When asked about it in later interviews, he would simply smile. That wasn't about winning, he'd say. It was about not letting someone else define what matters to you. That's all. Yet behind that humility, he recognized the responsibility it carried. In town halls and Senate speeches, he began to weave the same themes of courage and conviction into his message, not as slogans, but as reminders. He told young audiences, "Don't be afraid of the silence that follows when you stand up for something. Silence is often just respect in disguise." Even Oprah, years later, revisited the exchange during a reflective special. Sitting across from her audience, she admitted, "That night, I was speechless. And that doesn't happen often. I asked a question expecting to poke fun. Instead, I learned something. He didn't lecture me. He didn't shame me. He just showed me that faith, when genuine, commands respect. And I respected him for it." The admission, though brief, was broadcast widely, sealing the moment not as conflict, but as a turning point of mutual recognition. Abroad, the story gained traction too. Commentators in Europe remarked how unusual it was to see a politician embrace faith without anger, without arrogance, but with sincerity. In parts of Asia and Africa, Kennedy's answer was translated into local languages, quoted in newspapers, as an example of moral leadership. The ripple effect was global, carried not by political agendas but by the universal language of conviction. One evening, years after that night, Kennedy sat quietly on his porch in Louisiana. The sun was dipping low, painting the bayou in streaks of gold and crimson. Lily sat beside him, older now, her notebook resting on her lap. She had just published her first essay in a national magazine, a reflection on courage, inspired by him. "Uncle John," she said softly, "do you ever think about that night, the one with Oprah?" He chuckled, sipping his sweet tea. "Sometimes, but not the way others do. They see a viral moment. I see a reminder that you never know when life will hand you a stage, and when it does, you better be ready to stand on something that doesn't shake." Lily nodded, her eyes bright. "It changed me, watching you. It showed me that even when people laugh, you don't have to shrink. You can rise." Kennedy looked at her, his expression warm but serious. "Darling, that's the point. It was never about me. It was about you, and every young person like you, watching. If my moment gave you courage, then that's the legacy, worth keeping." The cicadas sang as the evening settled in, their song rising with the humid air, and for a moment there was no applause, no cameras, no headlines, only a senator, his niece, and the quiet knowledge that truth spoken once could echo forever. Years had passed since that unforgettable night on Oprah's stage, yet the moment lived on, not as a passing headline but as a story etched into memory. Generations retold it the way families recount their favorite parables. The night a senator was mocked for his faith, and the night he answered with such quiet conviction, that laughter turned into reverence. Lily, no longer the shy girl hiding in her hoodie, had grown into a confident young woman. She was now a writer, her essays published widely, often circling back to themes of courage and conviction. In lecture halls and community events, she was invited to speak about the influence of that moment. "I was 12, she would tell audiences, and I watched my uncle stand firm when it would have been easier to dodge. That night taught me that strength isn't loud, it's steady." Her words resonated with young listeners, many of whom had faced ridicule of their own. For them, Lily's story wasn't about politics or fame. It was about the courage to stay anchored when the storm of opinions threatened to sweep them away. Meanwhile, Kennedy himself had become almost mythic in the retelling. He never leaned into the fame it brought. When asked in later interviews if that night had changed him, he would shake his head. "It didn't change me," he'd say simply. "It revealed me." Those who listened understood. Conviction doesn't suddenly appear on stage. It is built quietly, day after day, until the world forces it into the light. But the world, hungry for symbols, kept returning to the moment. Documentaries replayed it, calling it the faith exchange. Podcasters analyzed the body language, the tone, the silence that carried more weight than words. And always, the conclusion was the same. It was not cleverness that won the night. It was sincerity. Oprah herself, years later, offered her own reflection. In a heartfelt retrospective, she admitted, "That night taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. I saw firsthand that faith, when lived honestly, cannot be mocked away. It stands. And standing beside it, I learned something about myself too." The clip became more than an interview. It became a mirror, showing people their own choices. Would they laugh along when others mocked? Or would they, like Kennedy, stand firm in what mattered most? For Kennedy's family, the legacy was deeply personal. Lily, inspired by his courage, launched a foundation in his honor, dedicated to teaching young people the values of resilience, integrity, and faith. Its motto came directly from his words: "If you're too embarrassed to admit what anchors you, then you're already adrift." Schools across the country adopted the program, giving students a platform to share their beliefs and values without fear of ridicule. One evening, at the Foundation's annual gathering, Kennedy stood before a hall filled with young faces. Some were nervous, some excited, but all eager to hear from the man whose story had sparked it all. He adjusted his glasses, holding the microphone with the same steady calm as always. "People think courage is about standing on big stages," he told them. "But real courage begins in small rooms, in classrooms, in lunch tables, in quiet conversations where someone laughs at you for standing out. Courage is deciding in that moment that you'll stand anyway. I had my moment under the bright lights, but every one of you will have yours too. And when it comes, remember, truth doesn't need anger. It doesn't need force. It just needs you to hold steady." The crowd rose in applause, much like the studio audience had years before. But this time, Kennedy wasn't speaking to television cameras. He was speaking to the next generation, handing them the torch of conviction. As the evening ended, Lily stood beside him, pride shining in her eyes. She knew the story of that night would never die. Not because it was a clash between two famous figures, but because it had become a lesson passed from one heart to another. And as the years went on, whenever people spoke of that night, they remembered, not the laughter, not the mockery, but the silence that followed Kennedy's words. A silence so powerful it spoke louder than applause. In the end, the legacy was simple. One man, mocked for his faith, chose not to flinch, not to fight, but to stand. And in standing, he left a lesson carved into history. That conviction, spoken with humility, carries a strength greater than power, greater than fame, a strength that can leave even the loudest voices speechless.